thank you all for coming here tonight when you no doubt have so many other things that you could or even should be doing. I'm really delighted to be back here this evening. I feel as though I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to be here last year in Doug's absence, and doubly fortunate to be invited back here tonight. It is, in fact, really nice to see so many familiar faces out in the audience. I had the opportunity to work with so many great students and colleagues that I'm really glad that you all came out to listen to me tonight. While I'm giving thanks, I also would like to thank the history department, who was the first one to sort of support me in this talk, and also the political science department for contributing to bringing me back here tonight. And particularly with the public policy lecture series, I'd like to thank Alex and Joan, who have done most of the arranging that enabled me to be here tonight. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to add that any opinion that I might express here this evening is my own. It does not represent the views of the Department of State or the policies of the United States government. Even though, of course, I'm talking about the Department of State and the US government. I thought that maybe the best way to introduce this talk would be to explain the title. It is a talk, as Doug suggested, about a former Reed professor, George Bernard Noble, who taught at Reed from 1922 until 1948. Before then, he had spent time as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and he was with the US Army in World War I, and actually was part of the American delegation to the Paris Peace Talks in 1919. After he served that little bit of time in the government, he began to teach at a few schools before settling here at Reed in 1922. Now, when I first started talking about this lecture tonight last spring, Darius was kind enough to direct me to a passage from Appendix E of the Political Science Major's Handbook, which says, quote, George Noble represents the faculty's long involvement in international and comparative politics. The Noble tradition emphasizes both scholarship and practice, and in particular, the relevance of political theory to the pressing concerns of world politics. So that's the Noble tradition part of my title. The to Washington part. In 1946, Noble was invited by the then head of the Division of Historical Research to come to Washington to serve as the assistant chief of that division. And that was in 1946. By 1948, he had risen to become the leader of this office. And in that role, he oversaw the production of a lot of policy background papers that were used by policy officials in the department. And also he oversaw the production of a series of government documents called the Foreign Relations of the United States series. Now, let me give you a brief history of the Foreign Relations of the United States series, or FRUS, as we like to call it in my office. This was established by President Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward in 1861. They did so at the request of a congressman from Ohio, and they all hoped that by publishing the record of US diplomatic correspondence, they would be able to really delegitimize the Confederacy by showing the skill of Union diplomats in convincing all of the European countries not to recognize the Confederate States as a legitimate entity. So even from the beginning, the Foreign Relations series has served both a political and a public relations function, if you will. But it became, over time, pretty quickly one of the most useful sources for scholars of US diplomacy. At the start of the series, the volumes contained only Department of State materials. It was quite simply a record or a collection of US diplomatic correspondence. And at first, the volumes were published within about a year or two of when the events in question actually happened. Now, since the series began in 1861, that suggests that we are in the 150th year, or the sesquicentennial of the FRUS series, which dovetails, excuse me, coincides nicely with the centennial of Reed. So we've got two big anniversaries going on here this year. Then the back again part of the talk. As Doug pointed out, this is not about me. This is about the fact that when Noble passed on, he left his personal papers to the Reed archives. And that's actually how this whole talk came into existence. I first learned that his papers were here on August 27th, 2010, when I received an email from a colleague of mine in Washington named Josh Botts, asking whether or not I would be able to get access to these Noble collection papers in order to help him with some research that he was doing at the time. I am, of course, honor-bound to cite my sources, right? So I should say that much of what I'm talking about today comes from papers that Josh found in archives in Washington and a couple of things that he has written. So I'm using some of his research as well. Both last October and actually as recently as yesterday, Gay Walker and Mark Kushner in the Reed archives were kind enough to help me gain access to these papers and lead me to some important and useful documents for my presentation tonight. Now, I'm not making any big argument about the history of U.S. foreign relations. I'm not offering any broad interpretation of U.S. public policy. Instead, I'm just telling, or trying to tell, an interesting story about how a Reed professor went to Washington, and he didn't clean up government, but he did change the way in which the U.S. government publishes its documents. And if that doesn't sound fascinating enough to all of you, I guarantee you this is a tale that is filled with high diplomacy, the possible unauthorized release of classified documents, and a small but nonetheless powerful right-wing conspiracy. And in the course of my talk, I'm going to be focusing on one set of Fruce volumes, a set that was created to document the major wartime conferences from World War II that came out during the 1950s and 60s. And in particular, I'm focusing on this volume, which covers the conferences at Malta and Yalta in 1945. And I'm focusing on this volume because it was the first one published, but also because there was significant controversy both before and after its publication. So I'll be talking about that. The earliest hints that we have that Noble and his staff were considering publishing documents on the wartime conferences was in 1947. And it was clear from the beginnings of this project that what they had in mind was just an internal secret project that would be only for use by department officials. It was also clear from the beginning that they knew they would have to go outside of State Department records in order to tell this story, and that they would have to go outside of the documents that they usually used for the Fruce series. In particular, they figured they would have to rely on FDR's papers and perhaps Truman's papers as well. What's interesting about the project, at least in its infancy, is that the office that was putting this together, the Division of Historical Research, really had no idea what had actually been discussed at Yalta. Even though it was 3 years after the conference, they didn't know what had gone on. And they only at that point had one set of records of conversations at the conference that had been given to the office by a longtime diplomat named Charles Bolin. And they actually assumed at the beginning that these transcripts didn't actually cover conversations between FDR and Stalin around some of the big issues that came out of the conference. Of course, they knew what the agreements were, but they didn't actually know what anyone said. And this was part of what they wanted to document. Now, by 1950, there had already been some discussions internally within the office to see if maybe it would be wise to publish these documents for the general public consumption. But in 1950, Noble raised a number of concerns with doing that when he wrote a memo to Secretary Dean Acheson. He suggested that these documents, they'd finally looked at some of them, he suggested that they contained some comments that might be a bit embarrassing for world leaders, both living and, in FDR's case, now deceased. He also knew that British clearance was going to be necessary in order to publish some of these documents, and he really wasn't sure if the British were going to allow their own documents to be published in an American compilation. He was also worried that if perhaps one day the Soviets published their own record of the conference, it could be embarrassing for the US government. And in fact, in 1969, the Soviets did publish their own record of the conference. This is actually 3 conferences, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. So I think that we did a better job. Nevertheless, even as the project remained internal, Noble recommended that perhaps at this time it wasn't a good idea to publish it for general use. People in the office did begin to try to gain access to military documents, the papers of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Anglo-American Combined Chiefs of Staff that had come out of the Yalta Conference. They also began to seek access to FDR's papers and Truman's papers, as well as the papers of former secretaries of state and other people who had been present at the conferences. And that's pretty much where things sat in 1953. So this project began in 47. In 1953, it's still a secret internal project. Of course, the US had been through quite a lot in those 6 years. The start of the Cold War, the Alger-Hiss spy case, the loss of China, as it was referred to, the McCarthy witch hunts in the Department of State, the Korean War, and Eisenhower's election in 1952. And then on April 22nd, 1953, the new Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, received a letter from a Senator William Noland, a Republican from California, that quoted at length from a memo that Noland had received on his own request from some unnamed source. This memo was actually the key turning point in the history of this volume. So I'm going to quote from it a bit liberally. The author of this memo said that the state archives were, quote, a rich mine of historical materials of immediate political significance, and stated that, quote, before the American people can know in detail the bungling diplomacy by the Roosevelt-Truman administrations, this material must be published. The author called for the acceleration of the publication of the regular Fruit series, which by this time had fallen about 18 years behind the course of events. And the author said that what was needed was a special volume on China in order to, quote, demolish the claims of the China White Paper and confirm the charges of democratic misjudgment on the Far East. And finally, the memo called for a special series on World War II diplomacy because, quote, if democratic holdovers in the Division of Historical Policy Research are prevented from excluding key documents, these publications could be of tremendous value. And you can read that entire memo in its entirety over in the basement of the Reed Library, box 16, folder 6 of the Noble Papers. Now, when Noland submitted this letter to Dulles, he sort of innocently suggested that perhaps the State Department could ask for additional resources in order to meet the requirements of these sorts of recommendations. Somewhat stunningly, at the next meeting of the Senate Appropriations Committee, on which Noland was a member, they gave Noble's office a significant chunk of money in order to increase the staff of the office to produce a special series of volumes on China and also several volumes on the major wartime conferences with the hopes that some of these would come out in 1954. So from this point on, the World Trade, I have WTC written here in my notes, which of course has a certain meaning. The wartime conference volumes were no longer an internal project for official use only. They were now a serious piece of partisan warfare. Now, as Noble and his staff began to draft a plan and get to work on the volumes, they were already aware that there were going to be a range of problems involved in producing a comprehensive record of these conferences for public consumption. In particular, they were worried about how they would gain access to and would gain clearance to publish documents, both within the Department of State, but more importantly, documents that were in other agencies in the US government or perhaps belonged to foreign governments. Nevertheless, they had a congressional mandate, so they pushed forward. And Noble allocated staff and resources to produce these volumes, and the Malta-Yalta volume was given top priority. And it was assigned to a member of the office named Brighton Barron. We'll come back to him later, but he was, like Noble, a Rhodes Scholar, and he was also a longtime member of the Department of State. Now, at first, in 1953, the management of the office was very optimistic that they would be able to get all of the compilation done on at least the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences by early 1954 and would be able to publish these volumes by the end of the fiscal year, so that's September. However, not everyone in the office was convinced that the management had moved ahead quickly enough to focus the office's attention on the production of these very important volumes. In fact, there was an internal review of the office conducted in the fall of 1953 that cited several complaints from people within the office that, in fact, the management had dragged its feet and had unnecessarily delayed the beginning of work on these conferences. Now, in terms of, I said one of the big problems was gaining access to materials. Well, a good example of that is the papers of Edward Stettinius. Stettinius was the Secretary of State in 1945, and he had gone to Yalta in that capacity. And he had actually published his own and very detailed account of the conference in a book called Roosevelt and the Russians, the Yalta Conference. Gripping title, which is actually on the bookshelves over at Reed in the library. So if anyone's interested after this, you can certainly go check it out. Stettinius died in 1949, so before work really got underway. But his paper seemed important, because everyone assumed that he wouldn't have published everything in his own memoir, so there had to be more in his papers that would be of use. And Noble began to try to get access to these documents. And there's really a pretty thick collection of letters between Noble and Stettinius' widow, also officials at the University of Virginia where these papers were held, and also a few other friends and associates who Noble thought might be able to convince the widow to give him access to the papers, but it was all to no avail. For 2 years, he tried to get access to the papers. She never granted him access. So the department, or the office, was never able to use Stettinius' papers in the compilation of this volume. And this actually happened in a couple of other cases as well. So some potentially useful sources of information were never accessible. Turning from problems of access to problems of clearance, in the problems of clearance, Exhibit A is definitely the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense historian, a man named Rudolf Winokur, provided at best grudging assistance in locating some important defense files and passing those along to Barron and to other compilers in the State Department. But Winokur was very reluctant on the question of clearance. In October of 1953, really the furthest he would go would say that he would consider clearing the documents from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Combined Chiefs of Staff. And then the following summer, in July 1954, when Noble sent the galley proofs of the volume, which had by that time been assembled in an almost complete format, Noble sent them over to Winokur and asked for a quick review and a quick decision to clear on the documents so that they could meet their September publication deadline. Winokur responded by pointing to a number of minor problems in the structure and content of the volume, but he also raised a couple of more important issues. He suspected that perhaps this volume, if it was released as it stood at that point, that it would come in for a lot more criticism than the China white paper had, because clearly parts of it were not complete in their documentation. He also said, quote, "More important is the question of whether or not the publication of these documents at this time is in the national interest." Nevertheless, Noble continued to push for the Defense Department to clear on these documents, and he continued to defend the volume against these and other criticisms that Winokur continued to make of the compilation. And their exchanges led to one very testy phone call between the two of the, between these two government historians. In this conversation, Noble said that the Defense Department clearance was not in fact necessary for materials that existed within State Department files, even if those materials had originally been produced by the State Department. The idea was that Noble felt it was State Department property. We can do with it what he will. Winokur responded to this comment somewhat incredulously when he said, "You're telling the Department of Defense to go to hell?" So these and other sorts of holdups meant that the Yalta volume got delayed and delayed and delayed over the course of 1954. You'll recall that the initial goal had been to publish it in September. Well, in late August or early September, Secretary Dulles decided that really publishing the documents before the midterm elections might appear to be slightly too political a maneuver on his part. So he decided that instead he would hold the volume's publication until after the November elections. All these delays caused trouble for some people. They just couldn't wait to get this information out into the public domain. In early October, Senator Nolan's office sent an inquiry to Noble, in which Nolan asked exactly who it was in the US government that had been responsible for Alger Hiss's presence on the Yalta delegation. Now, this inquiry indicated two things. One, someone on the inside of the State Department was giving Noland information that Noland should not have had at that point. And it also indicates the sorts of information that Noland and others hoped to find in the Yalta documents, specifically evidence that Alger Hiss had attended the conference, specifically at FDR's personal request, and also that Hiss had, while at Yalta, given the Soviets information that had enabled them to triumph in those negotiations and to get a much better deal than the United States had gotten. By the end of October, Noble learned that Newsweek was about to go public with an article that contained a whole litany of purported problems with the Yalta volume. And Newsweek was kind enough to send him a preliminary version of it. And when he read it, he found at least 10 examples of claims in this article that were at the very least faulty, but were in all cases based upon classified information. So either someone had actually given Newsweek the documents themselves, or at least had shared the contents of these documents with the press. And of course, one does not do that with classified information in most cases. So this raises the interesting question of who exactly was the leak? Who was giving Noland and others information? Well, a logical candidate, the compiler of the volume, Brighton Barron himself. So let me step away from the narrative for a moment and talk a little bit about Barron, whose papers are conveniently located just down the road a bit at the University of Oregon. So anyone who wants to do research on either of these two people, you're in a very, very good place. On November 30th of 1952, Barron wrote a letter to, at that point, the presumptive Secretary of State, in which he sought to obtain a meeting with Dulles in order to offer his own suggestions for the, quote, reorganization of the department in the interests of efficiency and economy and the fulfillment of campaign pledges. Dulles' assistant responded positively and asked for Barron to send his suggestions along, and perhaps they would be able to set up a meeting in January once Dulles had taken his position. Now, in a lengthy response to Dulles' assistant, Barron indicated that there were a large number of people in the Department of State who were hoping for a major house cleaning once Dulles came to town. And amidst a litany of accusations that he made of problems within the department, Barron highlighted that there were a number of friends and sympathizers of Alger Hiss who still held important positions within the department. In addition to all of these criticisms of the condition of the department, Barron also included a list of people who he felt would be able to fairly compile a realistic assessment of the sort of disastrous condition the department was in that Dulles could then use to clean house once he arrived. And in this list of people, Barron used the words of Senator Francis Case from South Dakota to describe himself as follows. This man, Barron, is a Republican and a career man in the State Department with an excellent reputation and a good educational background. He really knows the personnel of the department and has watched with dismay as it became infiltrated with Reds and padded with people who are not needed. So in addition to this particular letter in Barron's files, there's also a significant number of a significant collection of correspondence between Barron himself and his brother-in-law, a man L. Lewis Lillibridge, who was the president of the Burke State Bank in South Dakota. And there are also copies of a number of letters between Lillibridge and Senators Carl Munt and Francis Case, the senators from South Dakota. And in all of these letters, there are discussions of contacts that Barron was making with a range of people on Capitol Hill, Senators Munt and Case, as well as Senator Noland. And all of these discussions revolve around the Yalta volume, and they suggest that Barron may have given these senators documents, or at least discussed the contents of these documents with the senators. This, of course, was that right-wing conspiracy that I mentioned at the outset of the talk. So they were working to try to get these volumes out as quickly as they could, with the hopes that it would damn the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. Which brings us back to the Newsweek article. Now, in December, the editors of Newsweek denied categorically that Barron had been the source. But that article contained almost the exact sorts of criticisms that Barron himself had been making internally within the department in the fall and the winter. Criticisms of deletions of key passages, incomplete research because he had not been allowed to get access to key sources of information, omissions of key documents, and accusations that the role of Alger Hiss was being underemphasized. And in fact, in January of 1955, a reporter from the Washington Post informed Noble that someone from the Washington office of Newsweek had told him that Barron had in fact been the source. Now, circumstantial evidence perhaps wouldn't hold up in a case in a court of law, but it seems pretty clear that he was the most likely candidate for sharing all this information. To go back to the narrative of the volume itself, in 1955, early 1955, the pressure to publish these documents, both within the government and also from the public media, thanks to articles like this one in Newsweek, was really starting to intensify. But it was that moment that the volume got almost completely hung up and seemed as though it might never see the light of day, and we can blame the British. Winston Churchill had taken the whole set of galley proofs home with him over the Christmas holidays in order to determine whether or not he would clear the documents for the British. Of course, Churchill was once again the prime minister, and so he's clearing on his own conversations. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, he came back with a number of objections to certain passages that he had found in the compilation. At the same time, Anthony Eden, who was Churchill's foreign minister, said to Dulles that perhaps publishing this volume at this moment, so soon after the events in question, would be disastrous for US and for British diplomacy. With these sorts of concerns in mind, Dulles suggested to his staff that maybe instead of releasing the volume to the public, what they should do is just prepare a few copies and send them over to the relevant committees on Capitol Hill, the relevant congressional committees who requested and funded the volumes in the first place. And when Dulles floated this idea to Noble and a couple of other department officials, he made one very telling comment about the volume and its origins and its reasons for coming into being, and the people who wanted to see it come into being. Dulles said, quote, "They thought there was a lot of stuff which would be useful. Actually, there is nothing." Nevertheless, Noble stated a preference to see the volume be published in full public release so that the general public could read it and determine what had actually happened at the conference. But he decided, as Dulles had, because of the British concerns, perhaps it would be best just to make a few copies and give it to Congress. It does seem from some of Noble's comments, though, that he's really hoping that he would send it over to the Hill and then the congressmen would be unable to keep it under their hats and would just start releasing things willy-nilly. So he was hoping that it would get out one way or another, and he wouldn't be blamed for it, really. This decision not to release the volume, however, was made public in a State Department conference on March 14th. The next day, the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs of the State Department, Carl McCardle, acting perhaps on his, with authorization from his higher-ups, perhaps acting on his own account, gave a full set of the galley proofs to a reporter from the New York Times named James Reston. The Chicago Tribune pretty quickly got wind that it was about to be scooped on this big story and demanded a full a full release of the galleys to the media. At this point, Dulles basically threw his hands up in the air and said, "There's nothing I can do, it's beyond my control," and he released the galleys to the general media. This provoked a bit of a global uproar. It was really big news all over the world. I'm not going to go too far into the details, but to give a few examples, according to the Birmingham Post, Sir Winston was quoted as having said that the volume, quote, "is, of course, the American version. In no sense an agreed official record of the powers concerned." A Hong Kong newspaper wrote that, quote, "Both President Roosevelt and Marshal Stalin will be rotating in their graves over this. Roosevelt in anger and Stalin writhing with laughter." Of the release itself, rather than the documents, the Times of India said that it revealed Dulles's, quote, "utter incompetence to handle affairs of nations with necessary tact and discretion." The French government took, in this case, perhaps a legitimately self-righteous stand, and they said, look what sorts of disasters happen when you don't give us a seat at the table. Over in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's government was quite gleeful. They said that the documents clearly showed that Truman administration had abandoned the nationalists in their righteous fight, and thus the United States had a moral obligation to help the nationalists reclaim the mainland from the communists. The Soviets, for their part, just sort of brushed the volume aside. They said it was nothing more than a Republican Party ploy to damage the Democrats and to discredit the Yalta agreements. They, of course, got it, closest to the truth. But then the storm began to fade away. As Noble had suggested a little bit earlier, the statements that were contained in the volume that were causing so much internal consternation and some of the other questions over releasing particular documents, they were not, in fact, devastating to the people who had made them, nor did they pose any major damage for U.S. diplomacy around the world. For example, one of the big concerns was that some of the statements in the documents would cause problems for some votes that were imminent on whether or not to bring a rearmed West Germany into NATO that were set for the spring of 1955. But those votes actually went forward without a hitch. So clearly, the release of these statements did not damage the major diplomatic goals of the United States and the British. Brighton Barron did his best to keep the fire burning for a number of years. First, through continuing to disrupt the workings of the Historical Division, as it was called by this time, and through continuing to work with his congressional allies. And then, after he was fired, later in 1955, he actually published 2 books on the subject and spent most of the rest of his life on the lecture circuit and testifying before Congress about the problems with the State Department and these volumes in particular. Barron's efforts notwithstanding, the publication of the Yalta volume proved to be annoying in the short run, and there were certainly a few bumps that came up as a result of criticisms that were made of the documents themselves, but it was not fatal by any means for U.S. interests around the world, nor did it provide the sort of hoped-for indictment of the Roosevelt-Truman-Atchison crowd that the conspirators had been hoping for. However, the Yalta experience did have a number of important results for the first series and for the U.S. government's publication of its documents more broadly. First and foremost, in light of the difficulties that had come out in terms of publishing the Yalta volume and the criticism that it had received, the volume on the Potsdam Conference was actually held up until 1960. So they decided we're going to take this one a lot more slowly before we throw it out to the general public. Even before then, in 1957, the 8 volumes that had been proposed on U.S.-China diplomacy were actually canceled. And only at that point, only one of them had been released. There were still volumes ultimately published on China, but they were no longer special volumes. They were put back into the regular foreign relations process, or FRUS process. Overall, there was a growing sense within the State Department and elsewhere that perhaps it really was better to wait a bit longer before publishing such sensitive documents, that it really didn't serve U.S. diplomacy to get these things out immediately. A second big change was in the nature of the documentation of U.S. foreign relations. I said at the outset, right, that initially the FRUS volumes had only contained the State Department's records, that it had been an account of the diplomatic correspondence of the U.S. government. Well, as these wartime volumes showed, American foreign policy was much more complex than it had been back in Lincoln's day. And there were a lot more actors involved in making foreign policy in the middle of the 20th century than there had been in the middle of the 19th century. And this was even more so the case in the post-war period. For example, just thinking in terms of the National Security Council, which had been created in 1947, the National Security Council increased the number of players who were now formally involved in creating U.S. foreign policy. Thus, an accurate record of U.S. foreign relations would necessarily now have to go beyond the records of the State Department itself. And this was something that was apparent to Noble and to some of his subordinates at the time. One of his staff members suggested that the department should drop the phrase diplomatic papers from the title of the foreign relations volumes because diplomatic papers was no longer an accurate description of what the volumes were going to be containing in the future. Excuse me, in the future. Now, getting access to all of these non-State Department materials, as evidenced by the battles between Noble and Winokur, was really not going to be an easy thing. And in fact, the State Department was going to have to work pretty strenuously to forge formal agreements with all these other agencies to gain access to and to gain clearance for their particular materials. And over the course of a number of decades, the Office of the Historian, as it is now called, has in fact managed to achieve these sorts of memorandums of understanding with basically all of the relevant agencies who are engaged in forming U.S. foreign policy today. The third and final big impact of the Yalta crisis, if we can call it that, had to do with the process of producing the Fruit series itself. And this is where I'd like to bring us back to the Noble tradition, which you'll recall emphasizes both scholarship and practice. Well, as you might imagine, the scholarly community became somewhat concerned with the sorts of allegations that they were hearing that the Yalta volume had suffered from censorship and did not contain a complete record of the conference itself. And some questions were also raised when Barron was fired in the middle of 1955, and another one of his colleagues, a man named Donald Dozer, was also fired for reasons that were not initially clear to people outside of the Department of State. To those within the Department of State, it was clear that they had perhaps been involved in releasing things they should not have been releasing. But even though the scholarly community was interested in seeing a complete and accurate record, they had no way to ensure that what the department was publishing really met that standard. They had tried to get involved in the process of maybe advising the production of the first volumes. For example, in 1951, an American Historical Association Committee on Historians and the federal government discussed the possibility of setting up an advisory committee that would assist the State Department with the publication and the production of Frus. But they didn't really take any action at that moment. However, in the wake of the publication of the Yalta Galleys in 1955, that AHA committee once again registered an even stronger interest in establishing an advisory committee for Frus. Well, once the immediate furor over the volume had blown over by end of 55, early 56, Noble, in fact, wrote a letter to this AHA committee in which he expressed basically the same interest in having a group of historians, together with perhaps a few international lawyers and political scientists, who would provide advice to the department on the increasingly complex process of compiling Frus. And from this point on, things moved pretty quickly. There was a formal invitation from the department to the relative professional associations for nominations of scholars who might sit on this advisory committee. And a group of 7 such scholars was in place by the fall of 1957, and they held their first meeting with the Historical Division and the Secretary of State that December. From that point on, the Noble tradition of combining scholarship and practice has been an important, if at times disputatious, part of the process of publishing the official record of U.S. foreign relations. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.